And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
It was 1776 when the founders signed the writ of independence from the Brits. It was revolution.
Welcome to the Republic News Network National Live Broadcast. You may call me Kelby. Tonight I'm going to be acting as your moderator. It's August the 4th of 2016, and tonight's featured RNN show is Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. The RNN, which stands for the Republic News Network, has been doing this radio show for about 6 years, and it's always been a friendly introduction for the people of the United States Corporation. It is in fact true. The United States is a federal corporation, and their exclusive jurisdiction lies within the borders of the District of Columbia. And you can find this information in the law at Title 28, Section 3002 and UCC 9-307H. The Republic government was just a bunch of U.S. citizens that realized they wanted to become Americans again, the way our founders intended. We've been hard at work now for 8 years and have successfully re-inhabited the original government vacated under Lincoln in 1861. I know, it's hard. It's confusing. Don't worry. We are law-abiding, peaceful Americans and very pro-government. You can consider the Republic members are simply tired of this corruption that we see every day. See, we found in the law that there's two forms of government here on our land, and we did something about it. We are people, mothers, fathers, sons, daughters. We have families just like you. We simply found some truths, and now we're sharing these important truths with the rest of the world. So get ready to hear things that sound amazing, and get ready to understand that you too can be a part of history. We welcome each one of you to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel and the Republic for the United States of America. Before we go into tonight's broadcast, please bow your head in prayer. Father God, we want to thank you for this opportunity to tell the truth once again. Lord, help us in all that we're doing as a nation. Help these people coming onto these radio shows to learn, pick up, step up, and do something about it. We thank you, and we pray this in your Son's name. Amen. Mr. Dan Happel, I yield the floor.
Thank you, Kelby. Tonight we have on our Connecting the Dots radio program two exceptional gentlemen that understand the Second Amendment and citizen militias better than just about anyone in the country. We have the honor of having Major General Paul Vallely on our program, and Dr. Edwin Vieira. Dr. Vieira is one of the leading experts on the citizen militia and on the Second Amendment, and he is a scholar. He's an educator. He has argued cases before the Supreme Court, and won a significant number of those cases. And tonight we are going to be talking about the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution states the right of the people, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. I should know that one by heart somehow. I got on the wrong line. That is the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution, and it is very important that we have a good background, a good historical context to understand why the concept of the citizen militia was so key and so important to the structuring of our law and the creation of our Constitution, and why it was intended that the citizens, rather than the government proper, would have the right to defend themselves through a militia of the states and of the individual communities and individual people within those states. So with that said, I would like to start the discussion tonight. Edwin, would you like to kind of flesh out the concept of the citizen militia and how that was part of common law and part of our let's say, our historical background that created our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution and Bill of Rights.
Well, it's a pleasure being with you on this show, Dan. Of course, when you discuss any kind of constitutional questions, you have to put yourself back into the historical context. I mean, legal and political history of the original 13 colonies and the independent states is really vital in order to understand many of the concepts in the Constitution, because the Constitution is not a dictionary. It doesn't define most of the words that it uses. In fact, the one that is clearly defined is treason, and that's primarily because the Founding Fathers wanted to cut down the ambit of that term. It has been a very broad term under British law, and they wanted to limit it, so they defined it clearly in the Constitution. But if you look at the Second Amendment as an example, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, and you start asking questions as to what that means, well, the last three words are interesting. A free state. Actually, in German, it probably comes across more clearly. Freistaat, German term which essentially means a republic. And if you look at Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution, the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government. You can see the direct connection there between the concept of a free state and the concept of a republican form of government, that being a government in which the people themselves are the sovereigns and delegate certain limited and just powers, using the terminology from the Declaration of Independence, to their governmental institutions, always reserving the right and the power and the privilege to alter or to amend those institutions if they find that such action is necessary. And then, of course, you come up with the term well-regulated militia. Well, that's not defined either. But certainly it was not a word that was, or a phrase that was undefined in the minds of the people who wrote the Second Amendment. And you have to also remember that the Second Amendment, the Bill of Rights as an entirety, was added on to the original Constitution. It really doesn't stand there by itself. It was put in for the purpose of making sure that there would be no misinterpretations or abuses of the powers that were granted in the original Constitution. So if you look in the original Constitution, you will find the beginnings of a definition of this concept, well-regulated militia, because the Constitution in three places refers to the militia. Article 1, Section 8, Clauses 15 and 16 talks about the powers of Congress with respect to the militia. And Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1 talks about the status of the President as Commander-in-Chief of the militia of the several states. And that's really the key, that term, the militia of the several states. These were institutions, establishments, entities, whatever word you want to use, that were actually in existence at the time the Constitution was drafted and ratified. They were in existence at the time of the Articles of Confederation. They were in existence during the existence of the 13 independent states. And they were in existence from the middle 1600s forward in all of the colonies, save for a while in Pennsylvania because of the pacifists. So you can see that that term comes to the Constitution with a tremendous amount of historical backing to it. So if you want to know what the militia of the several states were at the time, and I can say this, I think without fear of contradiction, that at that time, the late 1700s, there was not a man, or probably even a woman, but there was certainly not an adult free man in the United States who did not know what the militia of the several states were, either because he was a member of one of them, or he had been at some time in his life a member of one of them, and now he was too old to serve. And if you want to find out what they were, you go back and you look at the legal history of the times, all the way back to the 1600s. You will find dozens and dozens of militia ordinances, acts, statutes, they gave them various titles, which lay out exactly the composition, the structure, the operations, duties, and so forth of these entities, which were the militia of the colonies initially, and then they became the militia of the several states, and then were adopted, brought into the federal system through the Constitution. And from that history, you will discover that there are certain principles that would define a well-regulated militia. If you look at these statutes, and as I say, there are dozens and dozens of them, they all follow the same pattern for the simple reason that the founders of this country, going well back into colonial times, were extremely practical people. And they wanted these institutions to perform certain functions, and the functions were essentially the same in all of the colonies, and therefore the structures of the militia were the same. And so you can derive some set of fundamental principles of the militia. I wrote a book called The Sword and Sovereignty, looking at this in excruciating detail. I came up with, I can't remember, 13, 15, 17, whatever, basic principles. You could probably make 30 or 40, depending on how detailed you want it to be. But the first of them was that they were based upon near universal compulsory membership. The underlying concept was that every citizen, and then they were talking about the adult male population, of course, because the women were not legally emancipated, and the social customs, religious customs of the time said we don't want women performing paramilitary and military functions anyway. But otherwise, it was universal duty on the part of all adult males who were able-bodied to serve in these institutions in some way. Everyone believed that he had a duty to his community to defend that community against whatever enemies might threaten it. And I include everyone there because if you look at those statutes, they include even the conscientious objectors.
Right.
Militia were, of course, paramilitary, military-type organizations. That's primarily what they did in those days because, of course, they had enemies, the Indians and the French, sometimes the Spanish, sometimes pirates, depends on where you were in the colonies. But people were trained to the use of arms. But conscientious objectors, of course, objected on a religious basis to the use of arms. So they were given other things to do that did not require them to bear arms. But universal membership was the first principle. And then arming everyone who wasn't a conscientious objector, training everyone to perform whatever militia functions were deemed appropriate at that point in time. And on we go. But the basic concept wasn't, you use that term citizen militia, because the Constitution doesn't talk about the citizen militia, but that was the concept. The militia was made up, was intended to be composed of all of the able-bodied citizens in each community, organized primarily at the local level. If you were in a colony such as Rhode Island, state such as Rhode Island, they would be organized on a township level, because that's the way their local government was organized. If you were in Virginia, for example, where the county government was the primary local government, that's the way the militia was structured. Why? Because it was an organization that was built from the ground up, not from the top down. It was composed of all citizens in their localities, their primary function being to defend those localities, and then in the next step the state, and the next step the union, of course, from whatever dangers threatened them. And that structure began, you can see it in the mid-1600s in Massachusetts Bay Colony, for instance. And then it develops through all 13 of the colonies and then the independent states, and it's brought in as part of the federal structure in the Constitution. And that tells you exactly what a well-regulated militia is. Right? Because the well-regulated militia that the Second Amendment is talking about are these things that the original Constitution names the militia of the several states. And we can find out how they were regulated, what well-regulation meant, by going back to this huge body of law in all of the colonies, all of the states, which regulated the militia. And it was interesting, you read the statutes or ordinances or acts, or whatever they call them, and how many times they use that word, an act for the regulation of the militia of Virginia or Rhode Island or whatever the colony or state might be, an act to amend an act for the regulation of. You find that term used historically in the law, and it's a basic principle of constitutional interpretation that you really have to go back and understand what the law of the time was and read that into these constitutional terms that are not specifically defined. So it's very easy to go back and see, and in fact, from the first act of Congress dealing with the militia in 1792 all the way to really to 1903, that same set of principles is applied to the regulation of the militia organization, training, and so forth. 1903, you have a break because that's the so-called progressive period is beginning, and you get the concept that government should be taken away from control by the people and put in the hands of experts, and the whole administrative state concept. 1903, an act is passed called the Dick Act, which created what we now know began to create what we now know as the National Guard. That process wasn't finished until about 1916. There were a number of other statutes passed. And it put everybody else into what the statutes call, and still call, the unorganized militia. That's everyone who isn't in the National Guard or the so-called naval militia, the naval component of the National Guard, and the unorganized militia, which is, as the term suggests, exactly that. If you go and look at the various state codes which cover this area, they will talk about the unorganized militia, and then basically that's it. There's nothing that it does. It's unorganized. Well, the first thing that I can tell you is that historically speaking, constitutionally speaking, that's an oxymoron. That's a self-contradiction. Constitutionally, there can be no such thing, and never was such a thing, as an unorganized militia during the period of the Founding Fathers, let's say. That's a constitutional impossibility. Right? All the militias were completely organized. They attempted to organize the entire community. That was the key to the whole thing. It was, as you say, using that term, the citizen militia. It was everyone organized in this military or paramilitary structure for the purpose of performing the functions of such an entity. And that's what we've gotten away from, because most people don't even think of themselves in relationship to a militia. In fact, that word now has received so much opprobrium that it's almost considered to consist of 4 letters, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you hear the word
kind
militia,
of a pejorative.
Yeah, people are talking about crazy guys running around the woods with camouflage outfits and AK-47 clone-type firearms, and had nothing to do with the constitutional concept. And I think the reason for that is because of this devolution, this steady development downwards from 1903, where the people in general, were removed from that fundamental governmental role that the militia is supposed to perform, as the Second Amendment says. Right? It's necessary to the security of a free state. And if you go back to the original Constitution, what are the 3 areas of authorization and responsibility of the militia of the several states? Congress has the power to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, repel invasions. Now, if you just took those 3, you would say, well, wait a minute, that's a pretty broad brushstroke picture of what we call today Homeland Security. Obviously, repelling invasions, suppressing insurrections, and executing the laws of the Union. Well, how many laws of the Union are there that might need execution?
Well, there's quite a few, and with that, I want to bring Paul Vallely, Major General Paul Vallely, into the discussion because, frankly, there are quite a few military people in our country that recognize the concept of the citizen militia, and that it was based on the idea that locally organized militias would have a strong sense of local custom, local law, and local culture, and that they, when they live, work, and socialize within their own communities, that they're more likely to protect and defend the citizens within that community. And Paul, you and I have had a number of discussions about the importance of the militia concept in our military system. Would you like to kind of expand on what Edwin was talking about, how important the historical context is?
Yeah, I'll be happy to, Dan. That was great by Edwin, by the way. It was a great historical wrap-up analysis of where we were and where we are today. I think, number one, when we look at the requirement for a militia and the rationale behind it and the decision-making to have that part of our Constitution, had to do with tyrannical governments. And, of course, the American Revolution was based on this on revolting against the King of England and that tyrannical government and taxation of the people. So when we look today, and I would like to probably stay in today and tomorrow, that's the way I think of what we need to do today and tomorrow to preserve the liberties and freedoms of the Republic, as well as all the individual states, that we know that our border security, for example, across the state borders, we know that when we look at borders today, they're not only the borders of Canada and Mexico, but our seaports are borders. Our airports, international airports, are borders. And I think the American people need to understand that the way we're structured right now cannot meet the challenges and threats of today and tomorrow. And when I say that, what I mean is, if you look at the police forces today, law enforcement, in our counties and local communities, and the budgets they have to live under, and the fact that we have attacks throughout the country now from rebellious radicals, attacking our men in blue, that they're certainly overtaxed, and they're severely treated by some of the inner city populations. And this new Black Lives Matter is a good example. So we look then at the National Guard, and as Edwin, defined that, we find that the National Guard today is not called upon to do what they should be doing in these illegal border crossings and border operations. And one of the reasons that I think you know this is the adjutant generals of each state are so beholden to the federal till and money that they're afraid to do anything for the most part, because they're afraid they'll get cut off. And America seems to forget that the adjutant generals, the National Guard, comes under the governors. And so my question has been for the last 3 or 4 years, why aren't the governors taking more sovereign action, and more sovereign action by the people, to protect our border states, our seaports, and our airports? And then we have, in my opinion, a totally ineffective Homeland Security operation that I was never in favor of, that Bush put in. There was better ways to realign our forces to protect America, and that's what it's about now. National security of our outer borders, national security of our inner borders, and national security from international threats. Now we add on the layer of the armed forces of the United States and a law called posse comitatus, where you can't use the active armed forces, against U.S. citizens. But now we have a different dimension, don't we? We have terrorism. We have people recruited as American citizens as radical jihadis and terrorists. So the world has now changed, and the key thing, the message that we all should present tonight is we have to adapt to a new world of threats to America. And so, Dan, you and I have talked a couple years about not having a well-regulated militia of any organization in the state of Montana. We do know that Texas has a very good militia organization, or at least they have had. I haven't been updated on it recently. I know Tennessee's trying to bring it back. I've talked with people there. Mm-hmm. And so as I look, I want to see sort of a rebranding of the militia to be more meaningful to the citizens. And I came up with a new name called the American Constitutional Force. Not changing the name in the Constitution of well-regulated, but rebranding it today to be meaningful to our young people, and what it is to have the constitutional forces who can augment our police, our National Guard, our armed forces, to protect the American people solidly wherever they live. And so what I've been working on is trying to come up with some kind of a message to the states that we reinforce and establish and bring into today's environment a state force that really is at the community level, town level, county level, that would be made up of citizen soldiers that would form this well-regulated militia, as I would like to call it, the constitutional force. And that's what it really is. It's, of course, based on the Constitution, on well-regulated organizations. So somehow I think we need to work on a new charter, Ed and Dan, and I'd be happy to sign off on something like that we can present to certain leaders in the states, that we can reestablish that, because it's going to get worse rather than better because of the threats against the United States, especially from radical Islam, that's really spreading their caliphate across the world, as we've seen with some 130 attacks just in the last 30 days, with over 1,000 people killed in the last 30 days. And it's going to get worse, because we cannot depend on the police forces to take care of us all the time and to protect that shopping center and be ready to mount either a proactive or reactive force to a situation that may occur in the cities. And guess where the terrorist attacks are happening?
Right.
In the cities, in the towns, shopping centers, movie theaters. And thereby, reinforcing the requirement of the Second Amendment on our right to bear arms to protect ourselves. But we have a global force now, United Nations. We have an administration that wants to cater to these globalists who would do away with our gun rights. And we've seen what's happened in Europe when they took away the guns, what happened in Australia.
Right.
So I think what I'm saying is I'd like to develop, and we can do it right here working with Edwin and others, to develop a new charter for this new organization to protect and secure the American people. So that's sort of where I'm coming from.
Well, the whole concept, Paul, of the militia, and this is something that both you and Edwin have mentioned, is that with a citizen militia, a local militia, you're going to be doing a better job of representing local communities, local laws, local customs, and frankly, they know the local citizens. They know if there's someone in their community that doesn't belong there, let's say. And I don't mean that in any unconstitutional sense. I mean,
but it's a local
they know that there's certain people.
Yeah.
Right. If they don't, if they're not a citizen and they're doing things in the community, the local militia would have a much better handle on who those people were, and they would also do a much better job of protecting and defending their citizens. And that's what the whole concept of bottom-up government is all about.
Well, that's why we're in trouble
and it works
today.
with the local sheriffs and the local police. We're all brothers in common here. And that's the message we've got to develop and get out there. We've got to move forward with this. I'm very serious, and we need to do something. I can get the national attention on radio and television and through my 20 organizations that I work with. So I just offer that up as a challenge, and it doesn't have to, it can be a Bill of Rights type of thing. I mean, it can be a couple pages to launch this and see if we can get something going, because I think it's required.
Well, I think it is too, and I hate to say it, but I think we are at a point in our nation's history where we have the same, let's say, perspective of our national government that the founders had of the king and the crown. And some of our folks at the national, at the federal level, are just as unresponsive to the citizens as the King of England was. And we've got a group now that, frankly, I think many citizens in the United States are nearly as terrified of their own government as they are of government from another land.
Sure they are. No doubt about it.
Yeah, I think so. Edwin, you've been quiet here for a few minutes. Would you like to say anything to what Paul just discussed?
Well, I think he's pretty much right on target. I'm just always leery of giving new names to constitutional concepts because that's, of course, one of the tricks that the Supreme Court has used over the years to move away from the Constitution. They start using different verbiage, and then they define that verbiage themselves, and the next thing you know, you're beyond the limits that the Constitution sets. I like to keep specifically now to constitutional language because then I can tie it directly to all of this legal and political history, which is the key to analysis, of course. But if you want to explain to people that a well-regulated militia in the constitutional sense is a constitutional force made up of people at the lower, you want to give them that kind of expanded explanation. I think that's wonderful because most people today have no conception of what we're talking about here on this.
Yeah,
on
well,
this,
that's what
program.
I'm getting to, Edwin. I think you're absolutely right, and that's where I'm sort of heading on the thing. Not to change the Constitution, but in this world today of information, and the young people I want to focus on so they understand this tie-in to the Constitution. And sometimes I call it rebranding to a slight degree. It's rebranding, but like you're saying, explaining it in a little more detail, more definitively for the younger people today and tie it back to the Constitution. I guess that's where I'm sort of coming from.
Right. I agree with that. And we look at the situation now where we have local police forces in this era of terrorism potentially stretched to the limit because it's very difficult to predict where these terroristic acts will develop. And why is that the situation? Well, it's because we haven't had a mobilized, organized, trained militia structure in this country for a very long time. Yeah. And so we've tended to depend upon these more or less elitist, careerist units called local police. Actually, if you had a constitutional militia structure, the local police would be subunits of the militia in that locale. You have county police, as we have here in various parts of Virginia. Those county police would be subunits of the county militia. They would have perhaps their own distinctive uniforms or patches or whatever. They'd be paid on a regular basis in the way the Minutemen were, or the Rangers, or some of these other elite units within the militia during the colonial period. But they would be part of the militia, and as a result of that, they could draw upon this much larger population base to help them in their functions. That's number one. Number two, they would not be an alien force within the community, and some police we know do go beyond the limits of their authority. There certainly is some justification for criticizing when that happens. If they were part of the regular militia structure in their town or in their county, whatever the local jurisdiction would be, then we would, I think, eliminate that problem entirely, because they would not see themselves as alien and separated from the community, and the community would never look at them that way either. All right? And thirdly, if we had the proper militia structure, then those other two armed forces in the Constitution, first the regular army, and then what we call the National Guard. The National Guard are the state troops that can be generated under Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3 with the consent of Congress. That's what they really are. They're not a militia structure, and they're not a regular army structure either. They're this third type of organization, military organization, which if you go back historically, you can see existed in the colonial period and the period of the War of Independence. But those two, the regular army and the National Guard, they have other functions to perform, high-level national defense functions to perform. We don't want to take away from the performance of those functions, bringing them in for disaster relief or bringing them in for local policing and so forth and so on. That's where the militia comes into play. That's what the militia should be doing. And thirdly, in some kind of crisis situation, we don't want to get into the habit of using regular armed forces, the standing army, if you will, the Army and the National Guard, performing law enforcement functions. That's something the Declaration of Independence specifically excoriated King George III for doing. He was setting the military up above the civil power, using the military forces, General Gage in Boston, for instance, to enforce the laws, the British laws at least. And we don't want to get into that kind of a habit. That is not something the American Army should be doing. That's not something the National Guard should be. But that is something the militia should be doing, because the Constitution explicitly gives to the militia the authority to execute the laws of the Union.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Edwin. And one of the things that grows out of that militia concept, and we have a constitutional sheriff in our county, and he has been very explicit about trying to get together with various patriot groups or groups in our county that he wants to get together with them and know that in bad times that we're covering his back and he will be covering ours. And that really is the role where a county sheriff can bring militia troops and various groups together to defend the community from outside influence, and we certainly don't need things like the UN sending Chinese or Russian or some other odd assortment of troops into our community to enforce any kind of martial law in the advent of an economic collapse or any number of other things. So,
and we don't want to be dependent upon an incompetent entity such as FEMA and the Department of Homeland Security.
Right. That's
have
correct.
To call upon
That's
them
correct.
in emergency situations.
Right.
Yeah, and the whole Homeland Security operation. I've done a whole study on that, Edwin, and we're going to put a lot of that back under what I call the Department of National Security. I'm going to take defense out of it because we want to be proactive. I want to do a lot with the Pentagon, but that's part of the Americans First Project is we do away with that Department of Homeland Security and really allocate to really modern type of operational type of organizations rather than these bureaucratic organizations. But we have a sheriff up here. He would cater more to the feds than he would stick by the citizens. So the sheriffs are here and there. They're political. And so the whole point of launching something, I think, Dan, is that, you know, if we could get a cadre of like-minded people to meet, you know, in Bozeman or someplace with this new charter we want to develop, Montana could be the signature state to launch this.
Right. But you only need one. I think that if you came up with the right template.
Yeah, exactly.
And you know, and most state statutory codes are very similar. And you come up with the right template to do this, and then prove that it can work. Obviously,
yeah.
Get it implemented. Then it will be adopted in other states simply because it is in fact workable and it's necessary.
Absolutely. So I think that really should be one of the to do things as a result of our show tonight is to develop that template and a charter that really outlines what it reflects as not only our Constitution but also what we need to do today and tomorrow to protect America.
Well, that's where the two great minds coming together to discuss this. I really appreciate having you gentlemen on this show. At this point, we need to break for just a few minutes to give Kelby an opportunity to do a short break, and we will be right back to continue to connect the dots.
Thank you, Dan. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to ask you to take a minute and go to our website, republicfortheunitedstates.org. Again, republicfortheunitedstates.org. Look at the last 6 years of both calls and radio shows that we have put forward for information. I would like you to take a moment and look at our Wednesday night call. It is the Building the States call. It's kind of like the grassroots efforts for us to be able to understand how to assemble peacefully, come before and look at the laws of the nation as it was back prior to 1850 and to build our cities, our municipalities, and our non-corporate states and our non-corporate counties. But we do welcome you to read and listen and look at what we've done over the last 6 years. And with that, Mr. Dan Happel, I'm yielding back.
Thank you, Kelby. At this point, I'd like to get into a discussion about the right of self-protection, which is an unalienable right under our natural law system, and how I perceive law enforcement and some of the federal agencies that were, I guess, originally intended to provide security and safety to the American people are now being used in ways that we see really antithetical to our natural law and our rights of self-protection. And I know that's part of how they're going after the Second Amendment. We are in many ways, I think, moving into an era of the police state, and more we see things like the BLM in being used in the Bundy Ranch, and also in Burns, Oregon, federal agencies that 20 years ago walked around and they knew clearly that their job was to provide and protect and provide for the citizens of the United States, and now they're under the idea that their mandate is to protect the environment and to heck with the citizens. And so a lot of these things have gone off track, and I'd like to get both you gentlemen's input on what you see as a way that we can get that focus back on track and get away from this concept of the police state.
Well,
Dan, I'm going to have to bow out in 5 minutes. I just had something come up. I'll try to come back on. How much longer are you going to do the show?
We'll be on for about another 20 minutes. So.
Okay, this just came up. It's rather important.
Okay.
And I'm going to try to think about what you just asked and maybe get back to you and talk to you personally on it to follow up. But I'm sorry to do this, but things are happening.
Sure. No problem. No problem.
And I'm sure you and Edward can carry this forward because you've got probably better answers than I do, and I'll try to inject something after a while. But thank you for having me on the show, and I didn't realize that this interruption would occur. So
no problem at all. And thank you, Paul, for being our guest on the show. And I believe we're going to plan on having you on in a few weeks because
absolutely.
I'm right now trying to schedule a program with Chris Tanto, parent of Toronto,
good. Yeah.
And
one
of the Benghazi survivors,
yeah.
and I want to put you guys on together. So
absolutely. Well, listen, continue on. You're doing a great job. I support you 100%, and we've got to make progress here because if we don't do it, nobody else is.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you, John.
Well, thank you, Paul. All right, Edwin. I guess I'll pass that one on to you, and I know you can certainly do a good job of answering that question.
Well, Dan, let's start off with a basic dichotomy. What's the antagonistic? What is the opposite of a police state? It's a free state, right?
Right.
And the Constitution tells us that. If you don't have a free state, you will have some kind of a police state, right? So if you want to avoid a police state, then you better have what's necessary for the security of a free state. And the Second Amendment tells us what that is. That's a well-regulated militia. Now let's look at the example that you gave of the BLM and the Bundys and the various other people out there, ranchers and so forth, who are having and have had problems with the BLM over the BLM's supposed enforcement of federal regulations and statutory guidelines. Go back to the Constitution. It's always a good idea to go back to the Constitution when we want to figure these problems out. Go back to the Book of Instructions. What's the one entity in the Constitution given the authority to execute the laws of the Union? Well, it's not the Army, it's not the Navy, it's really not Congress, it's not even the President. It's the militia of the several states. So let's assume, for purposes of argument, that Congress could pass some legislation for the purpose of regulating in some way tracts of land that somehow belong to and were subject to control by the government in Washington, D.C. Let's just assume that that's possible somehow. But that regulation would affect people such as the Bundys, the ranchers, and so forth, who also had a claim to use those lands. And now you wanted to have fair-minded enforcement of those laws, looking towards what I would call, a rational approach to dealing with the average citizen that would be asking or had a claim to use the lands. Well, instead of having an elite group of bureaucrats and paramilitary operatives coming out of Washington, D.C., these BLM armed folks, what if the militia in that particular state, Nevada, were the entity that was given the authority to execute those laws in that locale?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think for a moment that they would have had the problem that occurred with the Bundys?
No, I think it had a totally different outcome.
Absolutely. Be a completely different situation. We wouldn't be worried about what you were talking about. We wouldn't be worried about these kinds of federal encroachments if where these, and again, for purpose of argument, assuming that these particular federal regulations are legitimate, where they are going to be enforced at the local level, if we had a proper militia structure, that enforcement would be done by local people who would have in their minds very clearly what the local interests of their friends and neighbors, fellow citizens were.
Right.
They wouldn't be operating, in a sense, coming out of a vacuum from Washington, D.C. as a sort of space alien group that descends in the locality and dictates to the local people. They would be militia members who lived and worked in that locality and understood and had sympathy for the people and the interests of that locality. So these problems would simply not arise, or if they did arise, it would be very few and far between the situations in which this occurred.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, you look at that and you say, well, there you go. There's a solution. Solution to something that large numbers of people in this country are extraordinarily concerned with. So why don't we do it? Why wouldn't large numbers of people be willing to say, oh, yes, we need to, the word I like to use, revitalize these constitutional structures, and we as local citizens will participate in them to some extent. I mean, this is not 100% participation, all of your time necessary to do it. You know, in the colonial period, as I said before, the basic principle was near universal compulsory membership and service. And today you'd have the same principle. Everyone has some kind of duty to perform some kind of service in the militia. But we have so many people now with so many different skills that we would only need to have a small percentage of the local population actually performing those militia functions on a day-to-day basis. And the rest of the people could come in as part-time volunteers, or they could gain exemptions by paying some fee for that. So the militia would actually be self-financing. There are all sorts of ways that we could make the system work today far, far better than it ever worked in the past. And it worked well enough in the past, remember, that the founding fathers put the militia of the several states into the federal system as permanent parts of the constitutional structure.
Right.
These are not supposed to be discretionary with Congress. Congress is told to provide in certain ways for dealing with the militia, but these are entities of the states themselves. The states can't get rid of them because Congress is entitled to call on them. Congress can't get rid of them because they are state institutions. They are permanent. They are as permanent as Congress, the president, the judiciary, or the states themselves. And why? Because the militia are the embodiments, the ultimate embodiments of the power of the sword. They're that military power in the hands of the people themselves, the ultimate sovereigns. And that under our system of government, that's where you want that power ultimately to reside. That ultimate police power, that ultimate power of the sword, however you want to define it, should reside in the final analysis in the hands of the sovereigns, and the sovereigns are the people themselves under our system of government. And what we've done is to remove that gradually since 1903, so that the people have less and less an ability to perform that sovereign function, and in fact less and less an understanding that they even have that sovereign function.
Right.
That's what always amazes me, because you read the Constitution and a little bit of history. You don't have to have a lot of knowledge about history. Read the Constitution, look at it through the lens of that history in the 18th century, and you say, wait a minute, well, of course that's why that's there. Of course that's what it means. But we don't have it. So it's going to be an educational process, and that will have to start at the local level by hypothesis. These ideas are not going to come down to us from Washington, D.C. They have to come up from the local level. And I think that the template idea is really what's going to make this thing work. You've got to establish somewhere a pattern for performing this revitalization process, and then do it. And show that it works, and then others in other states will sign on because the need is definitely there. There's no question about that. And what I've told the people I've talked to here in Virginia, we have an emergency management statute which gives to each local jurisdiction the responsibility of devising an emergency management plan for various emergencies, all right, natural disasters or whatever, that ties in eventually with the state plan, and I suppose ties in at the upper level with whatever the Homeland Security and FEMA are generating. And what's interesting about our state plans here in Virginia is that they really have no participation by the average person. In my particular county, it's the fire chief who's in charge, and they have certain kind of experts who perform various functions within this plan, and the average person, his role is just to be told what to do. He really has no direct participation.
Yeah, it's the same thing in Montana.
Same thing in Montana. But the interesting thing is those plans are there, and they are capable of being expanded by putting in specific roles for average citizens who are organized around what I would call skill sets, because all of these emergency management plans are based upon various skill sets for dealing with the particular problems. And my guess would be that whoever the emergency coordinator in a county or town, we have a county emergency coordinator, they realize they don't have enough people on call to deal with a serious emergency. They would probably be very happy, and the sheriffs are usually tied in with those people, there's usually coordination there, they would be very happy to start developing volunteer networks of people to fit in to the various cubbyholes in those plans and be able to perform various functions to back up the 9/11 emergency responders and the firemen and whatever, all right? That would be how it would start. And then you'd bring more and more people in and expand the number of skill sets that would become part of the plan, because the plan, at least here in Virginia, the plan is developed by the local coordinator, all right? He has a kind of a laundry list of things that he has to touch on, but the specifics of the plan eventually come off his desk, and then he asks the Board of Supervisors, the local county governing board, to approve that. So there's a lot of leeway, certainly here in Virginia, and I would bet in other states, for using those emergency management structures to begin to bring in, initially as volunteers, people from the community and begin to develop and because organizing is the key. All right? The problem we have now, we're talking about the Second Amendment, we have a lot of people in this country who are armed and actually know how to use their firearms. But they are not organized in any kind of militia structure. They are not trained to respond to types of emergencies. And certainly if we're talking about something like backing up the police or becoming special deputies or whatever to deal with the type of really terroristic situations the general was talking about, well, you essentially have nobody. Right? I mean, sheriffs should have large numbers of people who are at least basically trained, so in a situation like that, he could call out a group of special deputies in a posse comitatus type situation. I mean, posse comitatus is useless if you're calling out people who are untrained, who don't know what they're doing, right?
And Edwin, that's kind of the fly in the ointment, and I hate to say it, but it's become a real problem in our country, is the fact that average citizens don't want to be bothered with anything that involves their having to participate or do anything that requires their time. And that is why we've lost so much of our individual sovereignty, our right of the individual.
Well, Dan, then we have to start with the unaverage citizen.
Yeah.
All right. Well, what's that whole saying?
And there are some.
The difficult we do immediately, the impossible just takes a little longer. Right?
Yeah.
We have to, really, you have to start looking around for those people who have this community sense that they understand that they owe something to the community. We are all in this together. You cannot be a radical individualist in a community setting, especially when the community is in danger. You simply cannot do that. Now, there are a lot of people that want to shy away. There are plenty of people who want to be free riders on the efforts of others. Okay, we leave them out for the moment. And we find the ones who are willing to put that time and effort in, and then we'll start shaming others, if that's the best we can do.
I think that's it, yeah.
Exactly. And I'm convinced that once this ball gets rolling, it'll be like the snowball downhill. Yeah. Because the times are propitious for this to happen. And if it doesn't happen, of course, we're going down the drain. I mean, this is an either-or black and white situation, all right? If we don't accomplish this, we're going to have terrific difficulties in this country. And I think if you start to accomplish it, people are going to look at it and say, oh, my God, that could work. That's what we need. And then they will begin to participate, even if their participation is the suggestion I made before, that each year the person who wants an exemption from the militia has to pay $50. Okay, we don't need 100% of the population. We can do with 15% of the population. You, 85% of the population, pay us each $50 a year. We'll put it into the militia fund to buy equipment, to provide for training, and so forth and so on, of the people who have essentially volunteered. And that way we'll become self-financing. And we'll get this thing up off the ground very, very quickly.
Well, you know, the bottom line is we need to educate our citizens in this country that if we want to regain control of our government, we've got to have bottom-up government, not top-down. And the only way we can accomplish that is if they get off their dead butts and start to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem.
Now, that's right, especially if they look at how incompetent so much of the government is. I mean, leave aside the question of tyranny. Let's just put that to the other side of the table for the moment. If you look at something like the FEMA operations in Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Sandy, you say, wait a minute. These people don't know what they're doing. Or when they come in, they do the wrong thing. They make a mess out of it. It couldn't have been worse if the local people had been organized and had complete control over the situation. Could it have been worse? Probably not. Almost surely not, right? I think that is something that you have to emphasize, too. But we can't depend upon these aloof governmental bureaucracies to step in with the right responses, with the kinds of emergencies that we're facing now. Not just natural disasters, industrial accidents, terrorism, for heaven's sakes, unlimited illegal immigration. So I mean, you run down the list of these problems that didn't exist 50 years ago, or they existed to a very small degree 50 years ago, and now they are coming in like a tidal wave. And the governmental structures that we have are not capable of responding or don't want to respond, whichever. I mean, you can analyze this in more than one way. But the result is we don't get what we need, whatever the explanation is. And if it's not going to be provided by these governmental structures for whatever reason, then we have to provide it or else we're going under. I mean, history does not wait for you.
Well,
Things happen.
It's extremely well put that it is that way. And the fact is that time is now. We need to have people come forward and understand what the role of the citizen is in the government of the United States. And the only way that's going to happen is if they start to step forward and they start to do what they need to do. Edwin, I would love to have this conversation continue on, so we're going to have to make sure that we have an opportunity to have you back on a future program to talk about not only the well-regulated militia, but the problem of the police state. That is, in my mind, a real serious problem and a potential problem that we could face in the near future if our government collapses. So,
absolutely.
I would like to give you this opportunity to maybe talk about some of your books and some of the DVDs and things you've been involved with, and give you the last 2 minutes of the program to kind of wrap up with things that you would recommend for reading and books and so forth.
Well, if you're interested in the subject of the militia, both from a historical point of view and modern-day point of view, what we can do to revitalize it, and also I have a rather long and detailed book dealing with the question of martial law and the police state. You just go to Amazon.com, look up Edwin Vieira, and you'll find all of those books. I have one DVD out called The Purse and the Sword, which goes into this in great detail. It actually also ties it into the question of the banking system and the Federal Reserve System. So that's all available through Amazon. And then if you just look me up on YouTube, you'll find a number of ad hoc lectures that I've done around the country dealing with these particular issues. And I should think that reading a few of those books, and some of them are really short. I mean, a couple of them are long, but there are 2 or 3 of them that are something somebody can digest in a couple of days. You get a good background on the subject, and that's what's necessary. I mean, most people just don't know anything about this.
Mm-hmm.
Most Americans. And I'm talking not simply the average man in the street. I'm talking about people who think of themselves as constitutionalists and patriots and students of American history and so forth. And I've had discussions with them, start talking about the militia, and I realize they just don't know from Adam.
Yeah, they don't have a clue.
So yeah, we have a big educational problem to deal with, and that's step one, or job one, as the Ford Motor Company used to call it. Right, job one: educate the people in what the Constitution provides, and then number 2, demonstrate how this can be implemented. And I think they're both easy once you get into it. This is not something where you have to be a Harvard Law School or Yale Law School graduate to understand.
Right. I think our founders were incredibly brilliant in the way they really put together our founding documents, because they were intended for the average man to be able to read, and incidentally, they were intended to be taken quite literally, and easy to read and easy to understand. And lo and behold, something that could be written in so few pages now, if our government were to do it, it would probably take about 40 feet of shelving at the Library of Congress. So.
Well, the Founding Fathers were extraordinarily practical people, and the Constitution is an extraordinarily practical document when you read it from that perspective, from the perspective of what were they trying to do? What were they trying to make government do under the control and for the benefit of the people? And when you look at it from that way, from that perspective, you see, yeah, it all does, in fact, fit together. It all does work. All the gears turn in the right direction.
Yep, very simple.
Yeah.
Rules
but you can't leave any of them out, Dan. It's a machine that is designed to function in a certain way, and you cannot remove any one of those main gears and expect the rest of the machine to function.
That's correct.
And the militia is one of those main gears.
And I think it's the main protector that we have right now in this country to protect us from really a federal leviathan that will eat us alive if we let it continue.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Kelby, I guess at this stage we'll turn the broadcast over to you and thank our listeners for tuning in on Connecting the Dots, and we will be back next week with another program. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Mr. Happel, and thank you to our special guest, Mr. Edwin. Ladies and gentlemen, that's going to conclude our call this evening. We appreciate you guys coming on these calls week in and week out. This call went a little bit long tonight, so we're not going to do any music or anything, but we do encourage you to go to republicfortheunitedstates.org, get familiar with what we've done, and look at the last 6 or 7 years of interesting information, just like General Paul Valet coming on the call tonight. We've had many colonels and different opportunities where people in the de facto, which is a corporate realm, are realizing that they do need to consider this republic. Mr. Dan Happel, appreciate you week in and week out, and that's going to conclude our broadcast for this evening. We'll see you next Thursday, 6 p.m. Pacific. God bless.